You didn't think I was going to do a whole summer full of history podcasts without having the Jim Marshall Hall of Fame talk, did you? Come on. Look, he was the Vikings for 20 years. He accomplished a whole bunch of things that are absolutely Hall of Fame worthy, and he's not in. And my thoughts on this are complicated. So let's get into him here on the Locked On Vikings podcast.
You are Locked On Vikings, your daily Minnesota Vikings podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What's going on, everybody? Welcome to another episode of the Locked On Vikings podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. As always, I am your host, your pal, and the kid you copied off in math class. My name is Luke Braun. You can find me on Twitter at LukeBraunNFL. You can find the show on Twitter at Locked On Vikings. Thank you so much for making Locked On Vikings your first listen of the day. And today we are doing more history stuff. If you have been tuned out because it's summer, I get it, but come tune in because we are talking about old Vikings things. If you were old enough to remember, it's going to be a nostalgia bomb. And if not, man, there are some really dope stories that you're going to want to hear. And one of those things is just the career of Jim Marshall. Everybody knows the name Jim Marshall, especially in Minnesota. They know him as, this legacy with the Purple People Eaters, one of those guys. But he really wasn't just one of those guys. Ask anybody old enough to know about the team back then, and they'll tell you he was the Vikings. He was the field general of the Vikings, especially on defense, but honestly on the whole team. And very famously, especially in the later parts of the 70s, when he was one of the kind of last veterans left over from the true heyday of the Purple People Eaters, he was basically an extension of Bud Grant on the field. He was the veteran leadership. And I think that's an underrated part of Jim Marshall. I'm not even going to look up how many sacks he got. You don't need to know that. I'm pretty sure it's like 20th ever, and that's really cool. And he's surrounded by Hall of Famers on that list, and it's like, great, that's probably should be enough. But if you really, the conversation with Jim Marshall probably goes a little bit something like this. 9 out of 10 times you have it. And I actually went on a Hall of Fame podcast, which is a cool thing, a while back, probably more than a year ago. And they asked me this question about Jim Marshall. And I think my thoughts have sort of evolved on it, but my nice dodge answer was they should just put the whole Purple People Eaters in as like a unit. Like imagine like a Legion of Boom exhibit at the Hall of Fame and all the Legion of Boomers get one bust like together as a whole thing. I think that'd be pretty cool. And to do that with like the Purple People Eaters. I especially envision that picture of them all blocking the kick against Green Bay. That'd be such a cool picture to get like a bust of and put that in the Hall of Fame. I don't know. Anyways, when it comes to Jim Marshall, the conversation is going to be something like one person says, man, how is he not in the Hall of Fame? He's got so many sacks and he started more games than anybody until Brett Favre, and he was a defensive end. He was incredible. He went to 4 Super Bowls. He's got all these accolades. He was in the Pro Bowls and All Pros all this time, and he's got more than enough resume. And then the other person says, wasn't he the guy that ran the wrong way that one time? Honestly, that's like a lot of the conversation is about that wrong way run. If you live under a rock, you might not know about this. But for that one person that has no idea or just started watching football like yesterday, look up Jim Marshall wrong way run. He picked up a fumble, he got turned around, he ran the wrong way, heaved the ball into the stands in what looks like celebration, although he insists that he just realized too late and he was trying to get rid of it or throw it back out of the end zone or whatever so it wouldn't be a touchback. I don't really believe him. I think that's saving face. I think it was just a brain fart. And he threw it up into the stands in celebration, and it was safety. And later in that game, everybody will insist that this is also an important part of this, and it kind of is. He forced the game-winning fumble. There was a fumble that iced the game that got picked up by Carl Eller, returned for a touchdown, and that's how they won that game. So, like, Jim Marshall, live by him, die by him, they won, right? Like, not even that big of a mistake. It was just such an infamous gaffe. And it's one of the stupidest things a player's ever done on the field. And that's sort of what you think of. I mean, if you Google Jim Marshall, how many places down the list is Jim Marshall wrong way run? And I guess part of the argument for Jim Marshall not going into the Hall of Fame would be about that play. Would be, look, the Hall of Fame is not the Hall of guys at the top of charts, right? If it were, we wouldn't have to have conversations about guys like Frank Gore, which that comes up to, I think, in this conversation. We wouldn't have conversations about guys like Eli Manning and stuff. They'd be clearly in. It's not the hall of people who won Super Bowls. It's not the hall of. There is no defined way to measure this guy in the Hall of Fame, and then here's the line, and if you're below that line, you're not in the Hall of Fame. Like that. That doesn't exist. It is a legacy place, and so your opinion on the Hall of Fame is predicated on what you think the Hall of Fame should be. Should it be a place honoring the best players through history, the ones who were awesomest at the sport? Maybe, but interrogate that anymore and you start to find hard questions to use that criteria on. What about Bo Jackson? Bo Jackson truly was one of the greatest players to ever grace the sport of football, but because of injuries, his career was cut short, and so he didn't have the longevity that you need, and he probably will never get in. But if this is the hall of the best players, Bo Jackson should be in. I don't think anybody disagrees with that. It's also not the hall of longevity. If it was, I think Jim Marshall would be in easy. But it's not the hall of guys who played the longest. That said, playing for a long time is a pretty impressive thing, especially in the 60s and 70s, and what Jim Marshall did to keep that start streak alive. I mean, this was not just a guy that got lucky and didn't happen to have anyone roll up his ankle. He played hurt. He played sick. He played shot once. He was cleaning a shotgun and he shot himself once, on accident, and he played the next week. The dude was absolutely insane. And that's going in the exhibit in the Hall of Fame, right? I think of the Hall of Fame as a museum. And what belongs in the museum becomes a much cleaner way, I think, to answer that question. Now, as far as I know, as of this recording, you can't bet on who will or won't get into the Hall of Fame. Maybe you can right before they do it. But if you want to bet on anything else about the Vikings, you can do that at betonline.net. BetOnline is your one-stop shop for all things Grambling. You can bet on how many games the Vikings will win next year. Over-under's 8.5. So if you think they'll have a winning record, then do it. Go bet it. Put your money where your mouth is. I bet the under, and if you're right and I'm wrong, I lose money, you gain money. All right? That's punishment enough. You can also bet on week 1 right now. You can bet on where the Vikings will place in the division, if they're second, if they're third, if they're fourth. You can bet on that for any teams. You can also bet on the finals. You can bet on WNBA or the hockey playoffs, golf, tennis, MMA, whatever. You can even play your favorite Vegas casino games. So whether you're building player prop weird parlays or you want to bet live in the middle of a game, go to betonline.net where the game starts. If you would be so kind, I would love it if you went to lockedonpodcasts.com/survey and took our listener survey. Tell us what we're doing right, what we're doing wrong, what you want. Give us your feedback. We're trying to make things better for you guys, and we can't do that if you don't tell us what that means. So go do it. And if you do it, you get entered to win one of 10 Ticketmaster gift cards worth $100 each. So go to lockedonpodcasts.com/survey to take our listener survey. Thanks so much for your help. So the Hall of Fame is a museum. I think that's the way to think about it. It is a place to honor the most important things that have happened in the NFL. The most important players that have played, the most important moment. I mean, there's also exhibits in there, but the most important people that have graced the NFL. And I don't think you can boil this down to anything super objective. I think it has to be a more vague, nebulous, like a term like important. Well, what does important mean? You kind of can't define it. And I think it has to be something like that you can't define. I don't think it is a place for necessarily the best players. Of course, it's going to be populated with the best players, but I think the best players more often are the most important players, and I think it's the most important people that have graced the league. That, the Al Davis is one of the most important people. He wasn't a player, but, the most important figures. And look, Al Davis, was he that good of a GM? Certainly not down the stretch. He had sort of a checkered tenure, but he was one of the most important people. So, of course, Al Davis is in the Hall of Fame. And so with Jim Marshall, I think that is an argument for him to be in the Hall of Fame. I think I've been persuaded, especially in getting to know Jim Marshall a little better. When I was a kid growing up, and even just until recently, until I kind of made the resolve to say, I'm going to do Vikings history for Locked On, and we're going to really talk about it. My sort of a vibe on Jim Marshall was, he was one of the Purple People Eaters who I didn't know all that much about, but he was just kind of one of the four, and he played for a long time, and therefore he got a lot of sacks, but on a per game basis, it was a very good clip. It was a very good efficiency, but he kind of got up on the top list of sacks more by longevity than by actually getting a lot of sacks. And it was it's how wrong is that, right? How toe off the mark is that for who Jim Marshall was? And so getting to know it a little better, it's like, if you think the Vikings were important to the NFL in the 60s and 70s, I don't know how you could think they weren't. I mean, they were in Super Bowls, they were a dynasty, they were in the playoffs every year, they were a contender forever. If you don't think they were an important franchise, then you're insane, and you need probably to pick a different sport to follow. Jim Marshall was the Vikings. If the Vikings were important, Jim Marshall was important. And that, to me, means he should be in. And I don't think he ever will be, because ultimately, the Hall of Fame is a legacy thing. And a way to ask, what is your legacy, right? This is why I think maybe Eli Manning will get in, even though a lot of people don't think he should. And I'm pretty sympathetic to both sides on that. But what's his legacy? What's Eli Manning's legacy? Is it being kind of an average dude for most of his career? No, it's winning 2 Super Bowls despite being an average dude for his career. And that's such a complicated thing to figure out, is the Hall of Fame a place for the best players? Eli Manning doesn't belong. I'm sorry. He was not one of the greatest quarterbacks to ever play the game. I don't think anybody thinks that he belongs among Dan Marino and Ken Stabler and stuff. But if only because the story of his first Super Bowl, 2007, 16-0 Patriots, beating them with the Tyree catch, that whole thing, if only because that story is so burned into the NFL, that's a legacy. And Eli Manning's legacy is important to the league. And almost, it kind of feels like if he were a better quarterback throughout his career, it might not have been as important to the league. If it was Peyton Manning playing in that Super Bowl versus Tom Brady somehow, is that the same legendary moment, or is it just like a pretty good game? Do we now look at that as the David and Goliath hero that you would write a movie about, or is it just like a time there was an upset and wow, they went 16-0 and they blew it. They couldn't even finish the last game. I don't know if that's as much of a legacy moment if Eli Manning is better. And so in this weird roundabout backwards way, being such an underdog in that game, partially by his own flaw, I think is going to help his Hall of Fame case. I don't think that's fair, but I think that's the way it is. I think that's the way the voters are going to look at it, whether they realize they're doing that or not. I think it just affects our bias. Like, hey, Eli Manning, man, he was there for some of the most memorable things we've ever seen. Of course he's in the Hall of Fame. And in the same way, that wrong way run, you think of Jim Marshall and you think of the wrong way run. Well, a lot of voters are like that. If they're not intimately familiar with the Minnesota Vikings, how many of them are, intimately familiar with the Minnesota Vikings? How many of them, covered another team or whatever? And that's going to keep Jim Marshall out. It's not fair, but it is how it is. And it stinks, and we can be mad about it till we're blue in the face. I don't think it should be that way, but it is that way. In a way, maybe that's appropriate. Maybe it is appropriate that Jim Marshall is kind of only honored in the world of the Vikings. And to find out and be rewarded with the information about who Jim Marshall was and what he meant to the team, you have to enter the purple void, You have to go into the Vikings to get that. And that's pretty cool. And so, in a way, once you really have, I think, a deep, true appreciation for who Jim Marshall was, then I don't think you need him in the Hall of Fame. And maybe that's where we kind of go with this. Jim Marshall was one of the first people to join the Minnesota Vikings. He didn't play his whole career with the Vikings. He was on the Browns to start. I think he played 1 year with the Browns and he got traded over. But he played every single Vikings game from their inception through the season of 1979. It was 20 entire seasons, and he didn't miss a beat, and that's really impressive. And like I said, him not missing any games, I think he is more of a testament to him than usually that kind of thing is. It's this unreal, superhuman toughness. My favorite Jim Marshall story is the time he got lost on the snowmobile, when he and a bunch of other teammates and some other guys went out on a snowmobiling expedition in Wyoming. This was after, I think, his first year in Minnesota, so it was like 62, and they all got lost. Their snowmobile ran out of gas. They had to literally burn his signing bonus to survive, like the cash. Like they had to use it to start a fire. So he was starting a fire with his money because that's the only way they could find warmth. And it's like, how much more of a Viking, that dude is an Iceman. Like, he had a near-death experience on a snowmobile. Not everybody on that trip made it back, by the way. Somebody actually did die, freeze to death out there. And they were like, that. He was like, that was the only time I've ever been scared for my life. But he was a big old thrill seeker. I mean, he would skydive and he would do these expeditions like that, and he would hunt and he would fish and he was a live life to the fullest kind of guy, and he was a total jokester. If you go read any account of this prank or that prank that the Vikings pulled, Jim Marshall's always in on it. He's always part of it. I think maybe my favorite, they were trying to play a prank on, I want to say it was John Michaels. I might be remembering this wrong, so correct me if I'm remembering this wrong. But they were playing a prank on one of the coaches that with Jim Marshall and another coach got into a shouting match, and they were standing on the roof of one of the buildings in Mankato. This is in training camp. And they actually got a dummy to push over the side and fall down. And so they got into like this, they pretended to have this shouting match, yelling at each other, and there's all this stuff. And then what looks like a body falls off. I'm pretty sure it was a prank on Bud Grant, and Bud Grant insists that he was like, I knew that was a dummy. I don't think anybody would argue with Bud Grant on that just because of who he is. But that's the kind of shenanigans, right? I mean, he was in on everything. He was the one coming up with and enforcing the rookie hazing. You got to drink this much and then see if you can practice tomorrow. And, and it was all very fun rookie hazing, This is not the like super horrific stuff like what you read about with like Penn State, This was all in good fun kind of stuff. And they'd play stupid games and they would play do dumb things in the dorms to pass the time and all that. And Jim Marshall was really the ringleader. He was very much the heart and soul. That to me, it's just so much more important than anything he did on the field. Maybe it's just because I feel like I'm just getting so much closer to the Vikings as a group of people, as a fan of this group of people. I feel so much closer to it as an entity because of all this stuff that I've been doing for the show. But it just feels like what made them who they were had very little to do with whether or not they won on Sunday. It was a group of people with a common goal working together and experiencing all this camaraderie and growing together and becoming more than themselves, more than the sum of their parts because they were together. I kind of don't care if that ended up scoring 31 points or 25 points or whatever. It just is so beautiful for whatever it is. And Jim Marshall's at the center of that. But he is not just a player on the Vikings. Like, he really was the Vikings. And like I mentioned, down the stretch when he was a lot older than a lot of the players, he would basically Bud Grant would tell Jim Marshall what would happen with the team, and Jim Marshall would run it. He was basically a second coach. And still playing at a high level and getting sacks and being this really exciting player. He, like all the Purple People Eaters, had this really elite, quick, explosive, get off the ball. He was, really fearsome and able to generate all this stuff. He was just a scary dude. I mean, he was completely insane, as all of these Vikings were. Just these totally like unhinged people that if you met him in a dark alley, you better turn and run. I mean, Carl Eller was a much scarier guy, but that guy with the sense of humor that he had and the positive attitude that he had, I love listening to Jim Marshall talk about, and most of this information comes from either what other people have written about him in books or Jim Marshall in like random interviews for like NFL film stuff or whatever. I love listening to him talk and listening to him tell stories because he has this fondness for the time. And he goes, yeah, we regret it. I wish we would have won one, but I don't know, man, it was the best time of my life. And it's like so back burner. As Vikings fans, we're made of pain. We're made of sorrow and, oh, what ifs and, oh, woe is me, I'm a Vikings fan. I think I've grown kind of annoyed with that in the last, watch the games, quit complaining, right? But at the same time, I get it. The 4 Super Bowls hurt. The Chiefs one seems like it hurt real bad. I mean, that you really kind of walked into that one thinking you were absolutely going to win. And that really was a total disaster game, gigantic upset. And then going, 0 for 3 in the 70s. And then, what happened in the 80s and Les Steckel. And then all the NFC championship losses and going all the way up to the stuff that I was alive for. And I remember how that hurt me. And oh my God, what if there were 8 of those? That's a nightmare, right? So I get it, especially for older fans that have been through all of that or just jaded at this point. I don't know. I guess we all deal with that in our own ways. And it seems like Jim Marshall's way of dealing with that is by saying, yeah, but if you didn't win, you still played the game, and playing the game made him happy. And so I don't know. It's like I went into this going, man, I'm probably going to have this really, like, I'm passionate. He should be in the Hall of Fame. And I do think he should. Like, I would vote for him for sure. I'd probably be doing a huge homer action, and I'm also completely okay with that. But if I had a Hall of Fame vote, I'd vote for Jim Marshall. Also, I don't think I'm going to watch him not get in every year and be super, super upset about that. Because what he meant to the Vikings is captured in the Ring of Honor, which he was, of course, in. And what he meant to the Vikings, like, all I want is for people to know what he meant to the Vikings. And so all I can do is do this show and talk about him and what he meant to the team and blast that around to as many people as possible so that they all know. Whether or not there's a bust in the museum about it, seems like it misses the point. Like, if that's all you care about, I think it misses the point of Jim Marshall. And I think Jim Marshall would probably tell you to go outside and go windsurfing or something. I think all of those Purple People leaders, I mean, Page and Eller, it's easier for them. They are in the Hall of Fame, but to them, it kind of seemed like, I mean, with Page especially, but with Eller too, I mean, he was like also wanted to be an actor, and they all understood that there's more to life than this. And it's part of the era, back in the 60s and 70s, these players didn't get enough to make this their whole lives. That really didn't become a thing until the 80s and the boom of holdouts and a lot of contract things and the strikes and all that. But all these guys that played in the 70s, I mean, they had like side jobs and stuff. Like, this was just a thing they did, and is one of many things that we all do in our lives. For me, this is only one thing that I'll do in my life, and is podcasting about the Vikings, right? I did something different before it. I'll do something different after it. And it's going to be the same for you, whether you're a kid in school or whether you're somebody that's already had a bunch of jobs. It's not everything, And whether or not his contributions on the field and did he get enough sacks to be recognized as the Hall of Fame, it just misses everything. There's just so much more to Jim Marshall than that, and what he meant to the state, to the team, to the legacy, to people like me who weren't alive when he played, what he means to everybody who dons purple on Sundays and goes and files in a single file line to go get themselves shot through the heart every single Sunday. What he means to all of us, I don't think we need the Hall of Fame to appreciate it. We would love it. It'd be super cool. And if I had any control over it, I would. But we don't need it. And I think once you can reach that moment, that state of enlightenment where you understand what he means, and you don't need there to be some official recognition of that. You don't need a plaque on a wall to tell you what he meant, and you can feel confident that you understand it and that you have your feelings about it and that it's part of your fandom. That's all we need. Screw the bust. We'll talk next week about anything that comes up over the weekend or whatever. Otherwise, we'll keep doing history stuff and getting closer and closer to actual camp. We've only got like 6 or 7 weeks, and we'll just keep doing stuff like this. I'll talk to you then. And as always, Skull.